Hi, good afternoon, everyone. And welcome to EntryPoint from Encyclopedia Virginia, where we take a look at the entries behind Encyclopedia Virginia, the free, reliable multimedia resource on the history and culture of Virginia. I'm Patty Miller. I'm the editor of Encyclopedia Virginia. And today I'm really pleased to be hosting today's discussion on the Great Dismal Swamp, past and present. We're going to have a great conversation today, just a few little pieces of housekeeping before we get going. Please share any questions you have on the Q&A tab in Zoom. Once we hear from both of our panelists, we'll open the floor for some questions. And also this event has optional closed captioning that you can turn on and customize anytime using your closed caption tab at the bottom of your window. So I'm pleased now to introduce our panelists for today. We have two folks who are with us today. We have Marcus Nevius, PhD, who is an associate professor of history at the University of Rhode Island, and also the author of City of Refuge, Slavery and Petit Marronage in the Great Dismal Swamp. He's also the author of our brand new entry on Petit Marronage in the Great Dismal Swamp. And I will drop the link to that in the chat so that you can take a look at that entry when you have the time. And also with us today, we're really happy to have Alexandra Sutton Lawrence, PhD, who is the Vice President of Conservation, Justice, and Equity at the Ocean Conservancy and a member of the leadership team at the Great Dismal Swamp Stakeholders Collaborative. Marcus and Alexandra, thank you so much for joining us today for this conversation. We are really excited to delve into the past and present of the Great Dismal Swamp, just an incredibly fascinating historical, cultural, and environmental landscape in Virginia. And Marcus is going to kick it off for us today with talking about much of the material that makes up his new entry in Encyclopedia on Petit Marronage in the Great Dismal Swamp. So follow along today. You can, at your leisure, read the great new entry we have, or Marcus's book as well. And we'll have a really, hopefully, a fascinating conversation when we're done. So Marcus, please lead us through this fascinating landscape in Virginia.
Patty, thank you so very much for such a kind introduction. It is truly an honor to share this forum with Alexandra today and with your colleagues with Virginia Humanities. I'll begin just by briefly going through a series of notes. This will keep me on track, of course. As an historian, I'm notorious for an extended story with excellent details. But the book is called City of Refuge, Slavery and Petit Marronage in the Great Dismal Swamp, 1763 to 1856. And it derives of my research of about a decade, or a little more than a decade, between North Carolina, when I was a master's student at North Carolina Central University in Durham, and then a PhD student at The Ohio State University in Columbus. But what I essentially attempted to do was to understand the broader scholarship of Marronage in the Atlantic world and to apply what we can learn from that broader scholarship of Marronage to the story of the freedom seekers who engaged in the Great Dismal Swamp's City of Refuge. And from that lens, I defined Petit Marronage as the most pervasive form of fugitive slave community formation, resistance, and negotiation, along with enslaver accommodation in the history of the Atlantic world. Because for one who might know about the scholarship of Marronage more broadly in the Atlantic world, you might think of Jamaica, for example, the legacy Maroon communities that today have, by virtue of treaties signed in the 18th century, legacy land claims in Jamaica. One thing that we learn, or at least historically, one way that Marronage has been categorized is in terms of volume and in terms of space over time, where historians and other scholars previously applied the label Grand Marronage, or large forms of Marronage, large scale Marronage, and Petit Marronage on the other hand. And to that end as well, City of Refuge is a grassroots social history it was really my attempt to engage in the primary sources of this history, to lift what evidence was possible to tell a story of almost a day-to-day experience of slavery and freedom seeking in the Great Dismal Swamp, with this context of Marronage as one lens by which we can understand it. And so to a degree, the outline of City of Refuge hinges upon what records I was able to make use of. These records were produced by the Dismal Swamp Company, which of course had its roots in the 1760s, and its first iteration extended into the 1814 to be specific. And then its subsequent companies or offshoot companies, the Dismal Swamp Canal Company, the Dismal Swamp Land Company, carried me through the end of the temporal scope of my book. It's a story in which relatively famous Virginians appear, such as George Washington, or perhaps his less famous but favorite brother, John Augustine Washington. But it's also a story of contexts within Virginia's history that receive much less attention, like the first slave labor camp that the Washingtons and the other partners in the Dismal Swamp Company set up at Dismal Plantation near Suffolk in the 1760s. The story arc follows other investors in land extraction or natural resource extraction or exploitation of slave labor, whose records allow for the historian to perhaps paint a granular picture of day-to-day experiences, Richard Blow, Samuel Proctor being among those. James Holliday, another agent of the Dismal Swamp Land Company, whose records provide evidence of the day-to-day experience of slavery in the Great Dismal Swamp, slave management in particular. And Edmund Booth, among others, an enslaved laborer who became free but opted to return to the Orapeak Canal Company's site in Gates County, North Carolina. I raise him as an example, along with more famous enslaved laborers who escaped the Dismal Swamp, like Moses Grandy. The sources are varied considerably, as you may know. For example, the appraisement of Dismal Swamp slaves, the copy that George Washington made that has been digitized as a part of the Rotunda Project by the University of Virginia Press, which offers us important information, such as the names of the first 50 or more enslaved people who were dispatched to Dismal Plantation, and who were documented there in July of 1764. And it's from these sorts of records that historians and other scholars have attempted to trace the histories of enslaved people who were forced to labor in the swamp, such as Harry, who Washington sent into the swamp, who eventually takes on Washington's last name. He becomes Harry Washington, of later fame, after having escaped Virginia by way of New York and winding up in Sierra Leone at the center of a resistance movement there against the British colonies agents. Several men named Tom who appear in runaway advertisements, having absconded from Dismal Plantation in the 1760s, and of course others. This is one of the runaway advertisements of one of the men named Tom, as you can see here, runaway from the subscriber, found sometime in April 1767. This one posted by John Augustine Washington and readily available by way of Tom Costa's Geography of Slavery in Virginia digital project. Here we have some of the records that are not readily available unless you have the opportunity to head on down to Durham and poke around in what is now the Rubenstein Special Collections of Duke University's Perkins Library. But it's in these accounts that we see some of the rations, particularly the pork rations. It's one of the subsistence foods that enslavers dispatched into the swamp that ultimately wound up in maroon camps as well. And we see significant evidence of significant volumes of pork sent into the swamp unaccounted for on the back end in some of these ledgers. The Gates County Register, in which Edmund Booth and others appear. This one housed at the North Carolina Division of Archives and History, an excellent source to engage, especially if you're interested in tracing the individual people who were dispatched to one portion of the Great Dismal Swamp in the late 1840s and the early 1850s. And then a separate set of sources, the ones produced by abolitionists who I found as I studied this subject really took an interest in the story of the Great Dismal Swamp after Moses Grandy began lecturing in New England in places like Providence, Rhode Island, and Boston, whereby the late 1840s and especially in the early 1850s, abolitionists, including the Bostonian Edmund Jackson, begin to write about the Great Dismal Swamp, not only as this place of refuge where slavery persisted despite local proponents' efforts to say that slavery would come to a gradual end, to do something different with this story, to make the connection between the history of marronage in the West India Islands, for example, Jamaica, Cuba, and Santo Domingo, and to apply it to the story of slavery and slave resistance and marronage, frankly, in Virginia. And it was really as I began to engage with these sources further afield from Virginia that the broader significance of the history of the Great Dismal Swamp story of freedom-seeking Maroons actually began to take shape for me as a student. And so I'll draw these comments about City of Refuge in particular to a close with this very famous image of the perhaps most famous Maroon in the Great Dismal Swamp, aside from Moses Grandy, Usman, the Maroon, who appears in a sketch that was completed by David Hunter Strother, submitted and ultimately published in Harper's New Monthly magazine in September of 1856. And we see here an image of a Maroon, frankly, who not only had some age, which suggests that perhaps he had been living in the swamp as a Maroon for quite some time, but also supplied with weaponry that could not have possibly been made within the swamp, had to be procured from without the swamp, from beyond the pale of the trees, suggestive of the internal economy of exchange, perhaps, between Maroon camps and slave labor camps that essentially provided the networks and subsistence pipelines by which Maroons were actually able to sustain within the Great Dismal Swamp. And so I will end there.
Thank you, Marcus. And now, having heard kind of about the past of the swamp, Alexandra is going to bring us more up to the present and a little bit of the future of the swamp and what we need to consider when we think about that as a space beyond a city of refuge and moving into the modern world. So Alexandra, please tell us some more about the swamp.
Sure. And is everyone able to hear me? Great. Marcus, thank you for that wonderful lead-in. I'm not sure how I'm supposed to follow that, but I think that I will tell you a little bit about why I believe I've been invited here, which is my involvement in the Great Dismal Swamp Stakeholder Collaborative. And so the Stakeholder Collaborative is a group of folks with strong connections to the swamp. We meet and we work together to identify policy approaches, education approaches, advocacy approaches to help protect and defend this really just irreplaceable area. We have a mission statement that is kind of threefold. So first is that we want to strengthen the relationship between cultural, tribal, environmental, and governmental organizations working around the swamp so that we are advancing activities that are equitable, inclusive, and mutually beneficial. And that's a real key part of the way that the Stakeholder Collaborative functions, is that it is a real priority for us to be elevating and amplifying the works of these cultural communities that are so deeply tied to the swamp, namely the Native American, African American, free people of color descendants, early colonial communities. And so one of the things that makes our group really interesting in the way that we function is that we consider the swamp also to be its own stakeholder, with its interests held in trust by the members of the collaborative. And so when we talk about what we are doing for the swamp, we really mean that we're doing it for the swamp, not to the swamp, not at the swamp, but rather that we see the swamp as having a kind of symbolic seat at the table when we're meeting and when we're coming together. This is a project that started in 2019. Back in June 2019 was our first convening, and that now feels like ages ago because of COVID, but it was only a few years. We came together in Suffolk, where we meet in the library, and the sort of progenitors of this dialogue and this collaborative were myself and Mr. Eric Shepard, who's probably well known to many of you as a descendant of Moses Grandy. He's been very active and encouraging tourism to the swamp and telling the history of the swamp and the history of Moses. And Chief Sam Bass, now Chief Emeritus Sam Bass from the Nansemond Indian Nation. And so as sort of the three progenitors of this group, we set this up with the idea that we would want to keep culture and keep identity and experience and history at the center of this, and then to invite conservation groups to come in and join sort of as a circle surrounding that. So we envision it as sort of a concentric series of protective circles around the Dismal Swamp. And that's also how we envision the kind of policies that we are looking for around the swamp. And so right now, one of our biggest project, obviously, is the National Heritage Area Feasibility Study. And so we had a bill introduced last year, the Great Dismal Swamp National Heritage Area Feasibility Study Act, that passed the House, was introduced to the Senate, stalled a little bit. And so we're continuing to work on that. But once we get that to advance, what that will do is allow us to start thinking about a heritage area as a sort of concentric circle of protection around the existing wildlife refuge. And that heritage area would allow us to uplift, to elevate some of these stories, to dig into some of these histories. Right now, we actually received a grant from the Association for the Study of African American Life and History to work with Fish and Wildlife Service to collect narratives of folks who are descendants of these various stories, these various histories around the swamp, to record those narratives, and then to be able to set up a website and set up a sort of public viewing place where we can share them. And so we have descendants of these identified unique individuals representing these communities, performing narratives about their lives. And I'm really proud of that project, really excited about the continuity that we're creating there. And so that is kind of big picture what we're doing and who the Stakeholder Collaborative is. You know, one of the things, but I would like to, kind of point to, it's not just a meeting group, right? It is something for which our members are really, really passionate and have these really deeply held connections to place. And so we've tried to honor that in a number of ways. And one, as I mentioned, is that we quite radically see the swamp as its own person and as its own stakeholder in our group, but also that the way that we hold our meetings, when we do them, where we do them, and how we do them are intended to be as accessible as possible. They're intended to be as inclusive as possible, and they're intended to showcase the different parts of the region that are so connected to the swamp. And thank you for the congratulations on the grant. And so that kind of sums up a little bit about what we're doing. One of our greatest successes has also been having Representative Don McEachin turn out as a real champion for our work, a real champion for the collaborative, and a real champion for the swamp. That is so thrilling to us and so exciting, just to have someone who sees our passion and who sees how important this place is and is willing to take that to a national stage. And we also have a membership of about, I think, maybe 12 to 15 different nonprofit organizations who act in the role of supporters. We have structured our groups so that those larger conservation organizations working at a national scale outside of the immediate region are non-voting members. They're supporters, but we really want to keep the direction of what we do very, very, very tightly driven by folks who are local and have these deep connections. So I think that about sums it up. And yeah, I will.
Thank you, Alexandra. Just a fascinating project. And I think we're it's just really thrilling to be able to present this as a space that is not just in the past, but to really talk about this space, how it exists now, how it's being protected. Let's start with you, Marcus. I'm going to ask a few questions, but then if anyone watching has questions for either Marcus or Alexandra, please put them in the Q&A and I'll get to as many as I can. Marcus, we were chatting a little bit and we're both from Northern New Jersey, not a place known for its natural landscapes. And so tell us a little bit about how you became interested in the swamp and why you think, how this story of the swamp kind of fits into the larger story of slavery in the United States.
Sure. So as a native New Jerseyan who attended North Carolina Central University for bachelor and master degrees, I found myself, especially during my undergraduate years, traveling about central North Carolina, looking around at the tall pine trees and what seemed to me to be massive amounts of space into which enslaved people could just disappear in the effort to seek freedom. And I found myself wondering what it would mean to actually learn more about the ways in which enslaved people, freedom-seeking people, engaged with the geography of their local region. And so I began taking this up as sort of, an undergraduate would write a few horrible papers, but perhaps maybe one or two ideas you propose to your professors catches their eye. And one such idea did, at least by the time I was a master's student, when I began thinking about Marronage, the story of the form of slave resistance, which is more traditionally known to be a Caribbean sort of resistance. That person was Dr. Freddie Parker at North Carolina Central University, who said, there's a person who's been digging in the soils of the swamp for several years now. This had to be about 2008 or 9. About 2008 or 9, maybe 7. Said you should check out his work. The archaeologist, that archaeologist turned out to be Dan Sayers. By the time I'd gone to Ohio State and really decided to commit to engaging in the archival side of this research as an historian, another professor, Alan Gallay, put me on to a friend who knew Dan Sayers, and that's how the visit in May 2013 for the swamp materialized for me. To visit the swamp, and this I think ties in well to the way that Alexandra describes the swamp as its own person, is to really learn viscerally the importance of this space as a source in and of itself. And it was from that point in 2013 that I began to really engage with the history of the swamp for its own merits, let alone for what it might teach historians more broadly.
Thank you. It's just such an interesting space. And Alexandra, tell us a little bit. The swamp has obviously been impacted by humans for a long time now. The various dismal swamp land companies and canal companies first attempted to, under the direction of George Washington and other prominent Virginians, drain the swamp. They were hoping for agricultural purposes. That didn't really work, but then they turned to large-scale shingle production, which obviously impacted the cypress and other native trees in the swamp. There was a canal dug, which changed the hydrology of the swamp over time. So it was a space that people were taking from for a very long time. And now we know the importance of what is a natural peat bog in much of this swamp. Can you talk a little bit about the environmental aspects of the swamp as a carbon sink and really how that fits into the larger story of the swamp?
Yeah, so one of the many values that's hidden in the swamp is that it is a tremendous carbon sink. And so it in fact has some of the highest numbers of what we call irrecoverable carbon. So it's carbon that would take thousands of years to be recovered were it to be released into the atmosphere. And that's because of the age, the richness, the depth of those peat bogs, exactly as you identified, the age of some of the trees there in the forest. And so one of the big threats to the swamp is obviously, as it dries out, it becomes a greater risk of wildfires. Those wildfires release huge amounts of carbon. And when it's irrecoverable carbon, we really can't get that back. So that is one immediate sort of ecological and climate related threat that they're under. There's, of course, the threat of ongoing development, ongoing drainage changes. You know, recently, I think about 2 years ago now, there was a coal train that turned over into the swamp, dumping all of that coal into the swamp. You can imagine how that impacts then the water quality, the water's balance, the pH, and, you know, all of these kinds of things. And we're also in a part of the country that has really rich biodiversity in terms of birds, but also in terms of amphibians and salamanders. And so as we disrupt that hydrology, then we're also disrupting and, you know, putting those species at risk. And so we're looking at the risks of biodiversity loss, the risks of species loss in terms of trees as well. And, you know, a little bit farther out west of the swamp, there are some sites where folks are doing longleaf pine cultivation, for example, but that's a species that would have been much more present in the swamp than it is today. And then, of course, like I mentioned, you know, risk of wildfires and that loss of irrecoverable carbon.
And part of your the designation of the national resource heritage area, is that the correct designation?
National heritage area.
Yeah. National heritage. Part of that does have an environmental component. It has a cultural component, historical component. Are there other areas that have received that designation, and do you know what they are?
Yeah, so there's a network of, and you're going to get me to lie in here, but I think 52 heritage areas around the country. You know, one of the ones that we were thinking about and we're kind of conceiving of or modeling after, well, two really. One is the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor that exists down here from South Carolina up through Georgia and North Carolina. And then another is the conceived of, not yet affirmed, but the proposed Black Belt Heritage Area. And so in both of these cases, you know, first and foremost, one of the cool things about heritage areas is that they give opportunity without restriction. And so they don't impact private property rights. They don't kind of create some of those challenges or those tensions that other types of designations can create, because they are not sort of changing or protective in that manner. But what they do create is an opportunity to delineate a zone in which we are investing more resources. And so by doing that, we can create all kinds of things. I mean, some of the things that some of our members have proposed, for example, are things like the Dismal Swamp formerly served as a shared hunting ground for a number of different communities. It's well within the Nansemond historic area and territory, but it was also visited by folks from the herring community, folks from other communities farther south, et cetera. Having a system of trails that can be followed so that one can learn about not just the historical, but our modern day Indigenous communities that are present across Virginia and North Carolina is an example of what that could look like, right? It could, something relating to the early colonial history, commerce, free people of color and their movements through the swamp. All of these are possibilities presented by Heritage Area.
That's very cool. It's just such an exciting way to look at a space. And Marcus, tell us a little bit about that idea of community within the swamp during the period that you're studying. Was there was a symbiotic relationship between the Maroons in the swamp and people who were enslaved in the swamp, enslaved in shingle production and other things. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between those communities and how they kind of shape that relationship themselves outside of to the extent possible, the bounds of the enslavers and the timber extractors who were kind of exploiting that space as well as their labor?
Sure. That is actually one of the core stories to consider, at least from the historian's point of view, with regard to what makes the story of the Great Dismal Swamp so unique in the history of slavery in the early United States. And that is to say that it was simultaneously a space of slavery and a space of resistance against slavery. The companies, especially in the earlier periods before the American Revolution, and even frankly, after the American Revolution, at least until about the 1820s, as far as I can tell, did not have so significant a presence in the swamp that they were able to corral enslaved people in ways that we traditionally think about when we think about plantation zones, or at least when we think in the space of public commemorations of slavery or public understandings of commemoration of slavery. But what actually happens in the history of the Great Dismal Swamp is that the slave labor camps are central to the enslaving companies' efforts to turn a profit potentially in the swamp. And it means they've sunk in a considerable investment into these spaces in terms of resources, in terms of capital, that in turn could be manipulated by freedom-seeking enslaved people who just slipped away from a slave labor camp to a proximate zone in the swamp, and who basically would not return to the slave labor camp without some form of accommodations from an agent who generally wasn't resident at a slave labor camp to begin with. In the northwestern sector of the swamp, your audience may know, Dismal Town and Dismal Plantation was actually managed after a certain point from Suffolk, for example. And so the enslaving company agents would visit at a time the slave labor camp to sort of account for who was supposed to be there. And they would quite often complain in the primary sources of certain people having slipped away and decided not to come back, or sending a message to say that perhaps send spirits and I'll return to a slave labor camp. The other side of that coin is that the supplies, the subsistence supplies especially, dispatched to slave labor camps readily made their way to maroon camps, and to a degree allowed for, although this wasn't a perfectly balanced diet, a supplement perhaps to what maroon camps might have been able to gain from the environment around them. So pork especially, that comes into the swamp by way of these enslaving companies, could supplement fish that might be sourced in the swamp, or other forms of natural resources that might be used by maroons. And so it really becomes this symbiotic relationship that ultimately is so well known, although not necessarily advertised locally, that abolitionists pick up on it in the 1840s and 50s. And it's actually this symbiotic relationship, that there are maroons in certain parts of the swamp and enslaved people at slave labor camps and other forms of the swamp who animate an internal economy that allows for the maroon camps to persist, but also allows for a space to get away from slavery if enslaved people decide to do so. That so takes up the imagination of abolitionists from afar. It's really a different form of slavery for them that ultimately feeds their efforts to bring attention to slavery's perpetuity in these new contexts for slavery that ultimately would mean that were enslavers to have their way, slavery would never come to an end.
And tell us a little bit, what's one of the things that is so fascinating about this space in popular memory and discourse at that time is it does become a source of popular culture, poems and articles and magazines like Harper's that were widely read at the time. Talk a little bit about how that becomes a space in the popular culture that way and kind of what that meant at that time.
Sure, I think one of the central sources that we should point out, of course, is Moses Grandy's own narrative, which includes very, very detailed descriptions of an experience of being enslaved in the Great Dismal Swamp, along with his very tragic story of having been essentially tricked out of, exploited, frankly, the savings from his overwork at least twice before he's able to purchase his own freedom a third time. But then, of course, you're referencing here Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem about the Great Dismal Swamp. And really, the story of Dismal Swamp slavery, or the story of the swamp as a city of refuge from slavery, these become complementary abolitionist tropes, at least in the way that I see them in City of Refuge, that really provide for abolitionist audiences and those who might be converted to the cause of abolition, the evidence that they need to understand that slavery isn't going to end without direct action. And it doesn't necessarily take one to perhaps read as much as they might engage with a Moses Grandi to learn just how serious the stakes were in this particular struggle against America's original sin.
Alexandra, now tell us a little bit. You did mention working with a descendant of Moses Grandi, who is probably the best known a narrative of work and life in the Great Dismal. What do you have numbers for the current descendant community? What's their relationship to this space right now and the collaborative? And you talked about gathering oral histories, which is obviously really exciting. What other ways are they active in kind of shaping this current story of the swamp right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we actually do not right now have numbers exactly. That's an area of sort of current sociological, I guess, surveying that we would love to do, is to really understand the size, the shape, and the texture of the descendant communities now. And so we are lucky to connect with a number of descendants just actually through them hearing about the collaborative, reaching out to us and wanting to connect with us. And I'm sorry, what was that second part there?
Oh, I was just wondering, what other ways would this designation as a National Heritage Site kind of, further their relationship with the swamp and their histories?
Well, I think part of what's important about it is being able to give a name to the history that you've lived, right? And there is this challenge, a difficulty sometimes in retaining a cultural identity, a sense of shared community, when there is no name for what you've lived through, what you've come out of, or who you are. And so being able to give a name to this place, being able to delineate that this is a place where a very special kind of interaction happened that created a special kind of history that cascades into today. Doing that is sort of laying a foundation for other things to emerge in that community. Perhaps then that leads, like I've said, folks to come to us and to say, hey, I would love to connect with other descendants. Do you know who they are? And we're able to do that. Maybe, that leads to some changes in what we see in the narratives that we tell, in the storyboards that go up at the refuge or at different sites, et cetera, in the way that we think about and conceive of the swamp and its relationship to people in our sort of common cultural mind. So.
Great. And I'm going to go to a few questions we have from the people who've joined us on Zoom. And I don't know if this is a question for you, but someone's asking, why is there not more archaeology being done in the swamp? I'm not really sure how much is being done in the swamp, so I don't know if it's a matter of more or less, but is there archaeology being done, and what's going on with that?
I will answer in a very clumsy way, seeing as I'm not an archaeologist, but I did spend time with the lead historical archaeologist in the swamp. My understanding is that the context for archaeology in the swamp is incredibly unique and incredibly challenging as a result. The peat bog physiology of the swamp and the acidity of the waters particularly make the preservation of any organic materials practically impossible in the swamp. And then the recovery of certain other forms of materials is also difficult. It requires a significant investment in different forms of technologies that can be used to look beneath the surface before one decides where to dig. Because the swamp's water table has changed over time, certain hummocks have been exposed that may not have been exposed in the past, or trying to determine where to look in this space that was as large as 2,000 square miles makes it incredibly challenging and daunting for potential archaeologists to take up. Now, all that said, what I understand from Dan Sayer's work is that there's been a considerable amount of material culture recovered from the swamp in the form of several thousand unique artifacts. And these, at least according to the last time I was able to chat with Dan, have been preserved at American University in the lab that he set up to the purpose. I'm not sure what else to say other than what is probably most obvious, and that is that the swamp is an interestingly intimate geography that regularly will discourage many from spending any significant time in it. And here I'm thinking about the particular insects and other forms of wildlife that will sometimes visit you while you're in the swamp.
Yeah,
What are you
visit you is a
talking
nice
about? You're
word.
friendly, Marcus. Friendly bears.
Cute mosquitoes, cute giant mosquitoes. I know Virginia mosquitoes. Virginia mosquitoes are not cute.
Indeed.
Alexandra, tell us a little bit about, do you have ideas about how the Dismal Swamp stories could be included in the K-9 social studies curriculum?
Yeah, so I will say that, so one of our most robust areas of interest is in public history, and especially in what that means at the K-12 level, and getting kids to understand really the importance, the significance of this place, as well as to the communities around it. So we are working with a couple of different groups. One of our members is a member of Daughters of the American Revolution. They've been working on a trail system, and I'm putting up some new signage that tells new narratives and new stories that is aimed at that K-12 age. So there's an opportunity for planned field trips, planned ventures that are complementary to the K-12 narratives that we're already building, creating. Another place where we're experimenting is actually in group specific sort of K-12 education. And so for the Nansemond Indian Nation, for example, creating resources for students and young learners who are in that community to learn about the historic significance of the swamp to them. And then we've also been looking at opportunities in the larger Virginia, and we have yet to look at North Carolina. Sorry, folks, if you are down on this side like me. But we've been looking at the larger Virginia curriculum mandates and identifying where are places where we can put in science lessons, right? Where we can drop in history lessons that are telling folks about the swamp that are relevant to the swamp. So those are some of the things we're thinking about. But if you've got ideas, reach out to me.
And that's an interesting partnership. One would not think of the Daughters of the American Revolution as being in partnership with these stories. Can you talk a little bit about how that works, or is that?
Yeah, I would say it's less a partnership and more that one of our members who's so passionate about the swamp is also a passionate member of that, and so she serves as that bridge, and she's been a real champion for our work. But I would credit a lot of it to Heather Barlow and to her passion and her excitement about finding new and unusual avenues to tell these stories and to get the swamp into the cultural imagination.
And it is an interesting space that really can unite a lot of different strands of history. That's, I think, what's so exciting about it. Marcus, I have a question. I think that's for you. Can you talk about the way in which your research engages with archival silence and how your work challenges those silences?
Absolutely. I love the question. It's a very astute one. I'll begin by foregrounding the scholar whose work has been perhaps most inspiring in that regard for me. It's Marisa Fuentes' recent book, Dispossessed Lives, in which she really asks scholars to engage fully with every single piece of primary evidence that comes before you, no matter how scant, no matter how bereft of important details or extensive details and the like. And then to begin thinking more broadly about ways that one can read against the biased grain by taking a broader understanding of historical contextualization and frankly using the years of study that you put into understanding a particular historiography, put that to use to actually engage with what's not necessarily recorded in a primary source that you may have before you, but something that may be plausibly contended with reasonable certainty, albeit it may not necessarily have been recorded by the primary person who may have recorded a record. And so what does this look like in the work that I've taken up, for example? It looks like my efforts to engage closely with the runaway advertisements for Tom, for example, to identify, first of all, that there were several men named Tom who ran, but then to dwell with what we find in the runaway advertisements so as to respect Tom's presence beyond just having been advertised as a runaway. Or it also looks like taking a look at the contextual paragraphs that sometimes appear at the bottom of a ledger or at the bottom of an account sheet where you find sometimes company agents actually describing some of the challenges that they have. They don't necessarily ever mention an enslaved person by name. In rare cases, they do, who needs to be brought to the attention of company members. And they most certainly do not characterize an enslaved person positively in this light. But it is a reference to a person that needs to be respected, that needs to be highlighted, that needs to be dwelled upon, and that needs to become, in many ways, the center of a story. And so the history of Marronage and the Great Dismal Swamp then can emerge from primary sources if one knows, if one respects that looking at primary sources requires sometimes reading beyond what appears on that page to also respect what we can plausibly say should also appear on that page, even though it may not.
Thank you. And Alexandra, talking about sources, we had a question about resources about Native American communities in the swamp, but just resources in general for people who are beyond Marcus's wonderful book, City of Refuge, that people can access to learn more, maybe if they're interested, if their ancestors community participated in the swamp or some way, or just generally interested. What are some resources you can recommend for folks? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, so I put one resource in the chat, and that is a tremendous story map that Nikki Bass, who's a member of the Nansemond Indian Nation and is, very widely known as an advocate of the swamp, actually helped to put together. That I think someone asked specifically about the Native history. That's a great resource for doing some learning. Another great resource is to visit Mattanock Town, to actually visit the public-facing side of the Nansemond Indian Nation's currently held lands. Thinking of some other folks who have been engaged in our project who have been tremendous sources of information. Of course, Nikki, Chief Sam Bass, following on Chief Emeritus Earl Bass now, both have been tremendous sources of oral history and oral memory. Catherine Benjamin Golden is another researcher who is up in Delaware, I believe, right, Marcus? Yep, she is up at University of Delaware in Department of Africana Studies. Don't quote me on any of this, folks. Okay, and she wrote her dissertation on memory and history in the swamp, and has done a tremendous look there. Eric Shepard, of course, has collected a lot of resources surrounding Moses Grandy. Christy Hyman also worked very closely with our Stakeholder Collaborative. She has just accepted a professorship down in Mississippi, but she also did her dissertation work on mapping around the Dismal. And soon you'll be able to take a look at our very own story map that we are putting together around the history of the Dismal Swamp. And so I would point to those resources first and foremost. Am I leaving anyone out, Marcus? And Dan Sayers, of course. How could I?
Dan Sayers and
Yeah.
Brent Morris too has a book
Yes.
coming out as well.
Well, it's just really exciting. It's a space that, for us at Encyclopedia of Virginia have often said, why isn't there more about the swamp? It's so interesting. And it weaves together so many parts of Virginia history. So it's just exciting to know this work is being done. We will probably start wrapping it up. If anyone has any last questions, is there anything you want to conclude with, Marcus? I'll give you both a chance to just kind of make a few concluding remarks if you'd like.
Sure. I'll actually take this as an opportunity to respond to Michelle Todd in the chat. To basically say that the Gates County Register is the most substantive of the registers. You'll find that there are perhaps a few others that have survived in piecemeal in various places. They're mainly archived in North Carolina in the state archives, but the short answer is no. The Gates County Register is the one that's the most well preserved of the bunch. But more broadly than that, the effort to acknowledge the history, the human history of the Great Dismal Swamp is something that should have federal recognition. And I find that the work that the Stakeholders Collaborative has taken up is masterful in that effort, and hopefully will yield finally from our congressional friends up in DC the necessary support to bring the Dismal Swamp's story to a wider range of people. And I think that work needs to be highlighted and needs to be celebrated at every turn.
Yeah, very
Thank you,
much
Marcus.
so.
That's so kind.
And Alexandra, I'll give you a chance to just conclude a little bit too. And as you say, visit the swamp. The swamp is a currently National Wildlife Refuge. There's many walking trails and signages and places you can engage in the story of the swamp, even now without that full designation. So obviously we're encouraging people to go visit the swamp. It's a magnificent piece of the landscape of Virginia. But what would you like us to think about as we wrap up here today?
I would just say that absolutely. So the swamp does have that National Wildlife Refuge designation. It's beautiful. It's incredible. It's magical. It is like no place you'll have ever been. And so I strongly encourage you to come out and visit this gorgeous place that I have been privileged to work as a part of.
Well, thank you so much, Alexandra. Thank you so much, Marcus, for your time, for sharing the story with us. As I said, please check out our new entry on the Great Dismal Swamp. And it's really a beautifully illustrated kind of walk through Marcus's work, through the archival work he's undertaken over time now. And thank you everyone for tuning in today, for spending your time with us. Please remember to support Encyclopedia Virginia. We are your free multimedia resource, state of Virginia history and culture, and you can help us keep EV free and online. So please support us. And thank you again for your time. And that is about it for today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Patty.
Bye.
Bye.